warm welcome to our book club. I'm Minnie Menon. Today we transport you to the beautiful world of the Mughals. It was an era, I'm talking about the early Mughals, of course, the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan, an era of great stability in the Indian subcontinent, an era of great wealth creation. And all of this is reflected in the opulence that comes through in the architecture, in the art, and the fabulous luxuries that the Mughal court was really known for. Today, we're putting the spotlight on a book called The Reflections on Mughal Art and Culture. It is edited by art historian and author Roda Ahluwalia. And it actually is a compendium of articles by scholars who are doing really fantastic work on the Mughal era from across the world. Roda joins us now from London. Roda, thank you so much for joining us. It's really fabulous to have you. My first question to you is really around the idea of the book. The Mughals are so well chronicled, and there's so much of scholarship around it. But this is a fabulous coming together, as I said, of a lot of scholars who've done an array of work on the Mughals. So what brought them all together, and how did you kind of select these pieces?
As you know, Minnie, this book began in the form of a seminar held at the Kama Oriental Institute in Mumbai, which I organized, and it was sponsored by them. And this seminar encouraged original thought, new thoughts, and fresh insights on various themes of Mughal painting and architecture and the arts, manuscripts, as well as a section on comparative cultures of the Islamic world of the early modern period. So 3 scholars have reflected and drawn comparisons between the Safavids in Iran, Persia, the European-based Ottomans, and the Mughals in the Indian subcontinent. The topics explored in the book, and I'll just go through, just touch on them so that we know what people are talking about. We first start with word-image relationship. Now, word-image relationship has been a very popular topic in Rajput painting for the last 10 years, but hardly anything on it really where Mughal studies are concerned. So we have Professor Kavita Singh giving an article on that. Then we have portraits of royal women, another interesting subject. And then we have changes in visual, language, and content of painting from the Akbari period to the Jahangiri one, which is my article in the book. Then we have murals painted on architectural surfaces, and we have sub-imperial patronage of Hindu temples built during Mughal rule by the Amirs or the Rajputs who were part of the Mughal Empire. And then we have a reconsideration of Mughal garden typologies. We have then the lapidary arts in the Mughal Empire. The lapidaries were royal karkhanas that were set up to carve hard stones such as agate, cornelian, jade, etc., where objects d'art as well as jewelry was made for royalty, for the Mughal court. And then we have another article on the history of the evolution of objects of art. And lastly, we have the textile culture of the Mughal city of Burhanpur. Apart from these 10 topics, the last 3 articles in the book reflect, as I mentioned, on comparative cultures of the Safavids, Ottomans, and the Mughals.
Right, and it's a fascinating study because we tend to look so within, right, when we talk about history. And I found it fascinating to see from the Balkans to Bengal, the stretch in that golden era of medieval history in the continent, and how these 3 interacted. So there are many questions. Now, I'll go back to get into a very fundamental area, which is really the new research that this is pulled out, or the new facts that this is pulled out, Rhoda. Because as I said, the Mughals are well studied. But what I found interesting in many of these articles is the perspective was one of curiosity with which the author or the writer looks at a particular subject. And I found it very interesting. For instance, Kavita's piece on how there is a dissonance between the art, the painting or the miniature and the text in many of the literary works of Akbar's period, and what does it imply, the symbolism that it contains. I mean, it's a fascinating read. So take us through an example of what this book tries to bring out.
So I'm going to give you some examples of how ideas have been challenged in this book. Kavita Singh's is one lecture. Kavita talks about, she's of course from the School of Arts and Aesthetics, and she talks about Mughal chronicles. Now, Mughal chronicles are, for example, the Akbarnama, Padshahnama, Jahangirnama, the illustrated histories that Akbar commissioned during his reign. And you would think that the texts of these historicals and the illustrations should match. In effect, the illustrations should describe the text verbatim. But Kavita, in her research, discovered that that was not the case, that there are wide number of discrepancies between text and image, and that caused her to do more research. And so she has produced this article in the book, which is called Mughal Chronicles, Words, Images, and the Gaps in Between. And she discusses various examples in the Jahangirnama, Akbarnama, and Padshahnama. And she concludes that the accompanying texts in chronicles had hidden meanings, layered with symbolism and metaphors, and that the reasons behind these discrepancies between word and image in Mughal chronicles was actually a calculated strategy that they used in the Kitabkhana or the libraries of Mughal India. Now, I'm going to go on to a few more, Mini, if you don't mind. And for example, in Dr. Laura Parodi's article, again, she's titled it Mughal Garden Typologies Reconsidered. Mughal gardens are often described as quadripartite charbagh gardens associated with the concept of paradise on earth. You know that what quadripartite means is four partitions. Charbagh is the same thing, char for bagh, garden. Now, what Laura decides is that what her research shows is that she challenges this myth of the paradisiacal narrative as well as the quadripartite myth as being mere scholarly conjecture. As she says, there is negligible evidence of both these issues existing before the early modern period. And she argues that Timurid and Mughal sources refer to charbaghs as terraced estates built on hillsides or gradients with terraces and pools, and that they were governed by function rather than form, the function being either administrative or residential. So she comes out with this new research, which is challenging. Then we have Professor Catherine Asher from the University of Minnesota, whose lecture is titled Muslim Kings, Hindu Temples, the Legacy of India's Multicultural History. And she discusses the construction of Hindu temples built during Mughal rule, not the oft-mentioned destruction of temples. Temples were built during the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, and they began because of Akbar's policy of Sul-e-Kul, which I'm sure you are aware of, but it means peace for all. And it's a policy of inclusion that encouraged the freedom of expression and thought and sub-imperial patronage by the Rajputs during the reigns of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. She's concentrated on these three reigns. And she talks about the Kachwahas of Amber Jaipur building temples, the Bundela Rajas building temples, and the Ranas of Mewar building temples. Then I've spoken about Kavita already, and then we have, last but not least, I'm going to talk about Professor Gulru Nechipoglu's challenges. She's from Harvard University, and her topic is titled Trans-Regional Connections, Architecture and the Construction of Early Modern Islamic Empires. And her article compares the architecture of the three superpowers of the period, the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mughals. And she challenges the assumptions that architecture has evolved in an unmediated fashion. or a linear fashion or a direct fashion. Scholars have usually studied development, whether it's of painting, architecture, or any of the arts, in a very linear fashion. She challenges this, and she says that the three empires were very interconnected and there was a lot going on between them, artistically, culturally, historically. And she concludes that the common links between the three empires, the common links being their shared nomadic roots, and the deviations from these roots enriched the architectural conversations between the three empires. And I wanted to show you a picture of the Masjid-e-Shah of Isfahan, which is used in her comparison between Isfahan, Shah Jahanabad, and Istanbul.
Yes, it's fascinating because, until I read this piece, I didn't realize the close parallels between them. Also, the fact that not only was the evolution of each of these dynasties similar, on a similar track, they also changed capitals pretty much along the same time, at the stage of evolution, which is quite fascinating. But I'm going to take a step back and go off script a little, Rhoda, to get our viewers an understanding of what were the influences in Mughal art. There are themes that are common across architecture, across the mural paintings, across the miniatures. There's a very strong connection with the Timurid Central Asian roots that the Mughals have. And you've done such seminal work around it. So for people who are not well versed with Mughal art, I would like to understand what were the thematic trends or themes that dominated the Mughal art during the reign of these three emperors?
Akbar started with, first of all, opening up the studio, the painting studio, and he encouraged painting straight away. And the Mughals actually looked to the Persian model rather than indigenous painting that existed at that time. So everything that was Persian was emulated, including the popularity in Persia of commissioning literary and narrative paintings, works of art, such as the Khamsa of Nizami, for example. Now, Khamsa means five, quintet. Nizami was the famous Persian poet. So stories, 5 stories written by him, like Haft Paikar, Hasht Behesht, etc., were illustrated in books, manuscripts, books. So that was the first thing that Akbar initiated. And then he initiated, where painting was concerned, he initiated the historicals, starting with the Akbarnama, going on to illustrate the Baburnama, chronicles of his ancestors, Babur, Timur, Humayun Nama, etc. Where architecture was concerned, I'm not that much of a scholar in architecture, but I think they did adopt some indigenous material taken from the Delhi Sultans and what architecture was there during Hindu times before the period of the Mughals. But it was painting basically and the decorative arts that really flourished during Mughal rule.
It was almost as if the soul of the paintings were in the roots of the Mughals themselves, right? So the Timurid connection also comes back. You see women with the Timurid, headgear, for instance, and the women play such an important role, which is also a very unique aspect of early Mughal art. And there is a fabulous piece on Mahim Aga and Akbar's own mother, who are portrayed as special women, because they're almost equated to the men themselves as a marker of respect. Take us through that, because I know it's a little bit of a jump in our conversation, but I think it flows in very well with the larger influences.
Okay, so it's Dr. Mika Nateef who's written a piece on royal women, portraits of royal women, and she says it's preliminary studies of only Mahim Anga, who was Akbar's foster mother, and Hamida Banu Begum, Akbar's mother. Now, these two women had Central Asian lineage. That was very important. And that's what she concentrates on. And she says that because of their Central Asian Timurid lineage, which was very important to the Mughals, they were very aware and biased toward their Turco-Mongol heritage. And this is shown in many ways. So she says, because of that, the portrayal of these women in Mughal historical chronicles, such as the Akbarnama, Padshahnama, Jahangirnama, etc., did not differ from the representation of men. They were given very frontal, important roles, and it was almost like an affirmation of their symbolic legitimacy that they had, and that mandate to rule that was being projected by placing these women in their historical chronicles as frontal positions. And here's a painting of Mahim Anga, who was Akbar's foster mother, whom he was very fond of, and who had a position of great authority in the Mughal court. So this is a painting from the Akbarnama showing her preceding over the ceremonies of her son's wedding. And she is shown next to the Emperor Akbar in a frontal position with her Chagatai cap, etc. It was a conceptual study of her to portray the legitimacy that they had to rule. And so these women in particular were elevated to the position of men. And Hamida Banu Begum the same. She was a highly educated woman. She was Akbar's mother. There are many paintings of her in the Akbarnama as well as the Jahangirnama, in which she is shown again as the center of the image in frontal position with the position of authority being represented. Of course, they were not veiled.
So let's take a look at your own essay, which is a detailed look at the art of portraiture during the Mughal period, interim between Akbar and Jahangir. You've focused on Ustad Nanha, who does work for about 20 years in the atelier. Take us through what we glean from his work, how it kind of evolved, and what is the influence he had on the subsequent artists.
So I focus my essay on portraiture and naturalism by focusing, as you mentioned, on the changes in the visual language and content of painting from the Akbari period to the Jahangiri one, by tracing the career of this Ustad Nanha. He had a predilection for painting chehre with uncanny, precision, and I add Nanha's narrative into the context, the broader context of my essay. Now, we know that European painting influenced Mughal painting to a great extent around the 1580s. And I begin my essay by talking about that. And I open up the discussion by giving the reasons for the rise of portraiture and naturalism. And the main reason, of course, is the influence of European painting. The Jesuit priests came in and brought copies of the Polyglot Bible around 1580 to Akbar's court. And from then on, European painting influenced Mughal painting completely. And portraiture began as a result of that. Another important reason is of course Akbar's Sul-e-Kul policy, which promoted egalitarian and open-minded climate of ideas, which I believe encouraged artistic expression. And Akbar's interest in history or commissioning historicals such as the Akbarnama, etc. As portraiture, I believe, was the means to assert Mughal legitimacy and the mandate to rule in these historicals. The Mughals were very well aware of Timur's, their ancestor Timur's portraits painted on the walls of a palace in Damascus, as well as portraits of Humayun painted in Kabul. And I wanted to show you this painting of the Rana of Mewar painted by Nanha, and another painting a little later on, portrait of Shah Jahan and Dara Shikoh, painted by him later on in his career. Now, when I bring Nana into the discussion, I argue that he was an artist ahead of his time and that he preempted Jahangiri period painting. There is one pivotal image in a Kamsa of Nizami that was commissioned by Akbar in 1595, in which Nanha paints an image which is very much in the Jahangiri idiom of painting, not the Akbari the Akbari style, visual language that was extremely crowded, full of action, etc., which is how the artists painted the Akbarnama, the Hamzanama, etc. Jahangiri period painting is one of quietude, of reflection, of naturalism, where the real life genre actually comes into place, and portraiture, of course, that he encouraged. And then I talk about Nana, and I mentioned that he should be remembered as this artist whose paintings entered into the spirit of the person and who seemed to preempt Jahangiri period painting, which I think is the apogee of Mughal painting. Now, Nana trained his apprentice or nephew, Bishan Das, and I do believe that Nana had more than that influence in the court, because he's the only artist you can see who paints in the Akbari period, the late Akbari period, in the Jahangiri idiom. And this is one of the reasons probably why Jahangir kept him on in his atelier, because from the over 100 artists that painted for Akbar, Jahangir whittled them down to just a handful of artists whom he preferred, whom he thought were all masters, and they were all ustads and masters in their own right. And Bishan Das became then, Nana's nephew became then Jahangir's leading court portraitist. So this is a painting painted by Bishan Das of Rao Bhara and Jasa Jam.
Right. One of the Nana paintings also has a little bit of a self-portrait of Nana actually sitting in the crowd in the bar.
The painting of the Maharana of Mewar, which I show first in my essay. It has Nana on the bottom right-hand corner, seated there with an easel, painting from the scene from real life. And it's a submission, of course, of the Maharana of Mewar to Prince Khurram, which was a very important event that took place in 1615.
Right. What I have with me, my reference notes from the last lecture I attended, which you gave. So I'm going to ask you. No, but I want to know, for example, you made a fantastic point about how the European influence on Mughal art portraiture can be seen. And you refer to the idea of perspective coming in because of the Europeans. Explain to us what was art like before and what was it after? I mean, so how did it change by the late 16th century?
Before the advent of the Mughals, we had in India indigenous painting. The painting done by the Rajputs, which was mainly mural paintings on the walls of their temples and palaces, as well as painting of narratives, some of them, like, for example, the Chaura Panchasika, which had a style that was an extremely simple style, because the Rajputs did not really adopt aesthetic culture or aesthetic points such as perspective, etc. Their main reason was to paint for the reasons of to show bhav and to show rasa in their painting. So painting was sort of in a horizontal 4T format, basically just with a few primary colors, a high horizon, and very unrealistic. Buddhist painting was similar, very iconic, painted first on palm leaves, then on manuscripts of their religious leaders, the Buddha, Bodhisattvas, etc. Jain painting was similar. It was iconic painting painted on palm leaves and then on paper of their Jinnas and Tirthankaras, etc. And mural paintings, Buddhist mural paintings such as the paintings at Alchi, the paintings at Ajanta. And then the Mughals came in and they brought with them the arts of the book, beginning with the illumination of the Quran, as well as narrative painting from Persia. And the Rajputs and the Deccani courts as well, in the Pahari region, in the regions of Rajasthan, central India, they seemed to emulate the Mughal impulse to paint. And so they started setting up ateliers in their courts. And this led to a complete blossoming of painting that took place around the 16th century and carried on till the 19th century. But of course, Rajput painting, for example, differed very much from Mughal painting. Mughal painting took the path of European painting in that their themes were their own, but their style changed to adopt, as I mentioned before, the naturalism of European painting and the spatial perspective. Uh, Spatial perspective is produced by opening up the page to from a kind of bird's eye vantage viewpoint rather than a stationary horizontal viewpoint, which is what, or close up, which is what viewpoint, which is what how the Rajputs painted. So Rajput and Mughal painting was different, not only in their styles, but also in the content of painting. Mughal style, as I mentioned before, was, it had naturalistic elements, and it had the spatial perspective or the bird's eye viewpoint. And their themes were different. Mughal themes were literary themes from Persia, the historicals. The Rajputs obviously commissioned paintings that were endearing to them, the themes that were endearing to them, such as the Ragamala, the Baramasa, the songs of the seasons, Rasika Priya, the Rasa Manjari, Riti Kavya poetry, or the Geet Govind of Jayadev, or the Bhagavad Puran, which the Bhakti had taken off at that time. So there were many manuscripts painted of Krishna's early life, etc. And the Deccan courts, they also looked to the Persian and Ottoman courts for their initial and continuing inspiration.
Right. Even within the Mughal period, from Akbar to Jahangir to Shah Jahan, there is a change in themes, a change in preferences, right? I mean, Akbar's time, it was more historical, more about chronicling the making of the empire almost. Jahangir was a naturalist, his love for animals, his curiosity of what he saw around. And by the time Shah Jahan came, like you mentioned in your lecture, it was more formal. It was the height of Mughal glory. There was a formality. There was this gilded period, so to say, which comes through in this art. So take us through this transition that you see as an art historian.
As you rightly mentioned, Akbar began and he popularized the illustrating of historicals, beginning with the Akbarnama, the Tarikh-i-Alfi, then the Akbarnama, and then the Timurnama, etc. went on. Jahangir preferred naturalistic painting, and his paintings were with a great deal of European influence. And I want to show you this painting of the Padshahnama that's in the book, showing a hierarchical situation, which is what Padshahnama paintings were all about. Paintings by this time had become very formal and very rigid, I feel, not as naturalistic as paintings during the Jahangiri period. Shah Jahani painting is the painting of perfection, in which the Karina, or a counter image, he was very fond of architecture, and so everything was, and he was very fond of jewelry, and everything had to be perfect. So even paintings were perfect in that his court painters like Bichitter, etc., painted paintings, say for example, where you can draw a line through the center of the painting, and one half of the painting is almost the same as the other half. So there's not much naturalism. There's more a focus on hierarchy, the importance of the emperor, who was the king of the world, because that's what Padshahnama means. That's the historical chronicle written in Shah Jahan's reign, the Padshahnama. It means the king of the world. And so you see in this painting a hierarchical situation whereby Shah Jahan, his sons, and Asaf Khan, the Divan, who's also his father-in-law, is shown on the topmost tier level. The middle tier level will have courtiers and subjects who were of great influence at that time, the Divan, like Ibn-ud-Dawla, etc., who were family members, so to speak. And then the third layer would have courtiers who were not that important. So there's this hierarchical status that is developed during Shah Jahan's paintings. And then, of course, Aurangzeb, as you know, Aurangzeb came along and unfortunately banned painting
There's an
So there
austerity,
are,
even in the way he's portrayed, there is an austerity to it, right?
yeah, there's a great austerity. Painting becomes very stylized and very rigid from then on.
You refer to the comparisons being drawn in some of the articles, in the series of articles over here, of the three worlds, the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal, from the Balkans
Yes.
to the Bengal region, so to say.
Yes.
Ottomans, of course, come a little earlier, but they all have very strong parallels in the way they evolve from their nomadic roots to the height of their empire. But there is a parallel drawn. So take us through the connectivity or the commonality of histories here.
I'm going to just talk about these three articles, Mini, first, and I may even quote from one of them because I want to show you the interconnectedness of the cultures from these three articles. And when I talk about the articles, you'll get an idea of the interconnectedness or non-interconnectedness of the three empires. First, we talk about Gulru Nechipoglu's article. She talks about trans-regional connections, architecture, and the construction of early modern Islamic empires. And she challenges the assumptions, as I mentioned, that architecture has evolved in an unmediated fashion. And I wanted to quote from her article, if I may, to give you an idea of what was going on at that time between the three empires architecturally, when they were building the cities of Shah Jahanabad, Isfahan, and Istanbul. So I'm quoting from her article. She says, Isfahan, which aspired to compete with Istanbul and Agra, stimulated in turn the planning of Shah Jahanabad. In fact, during an audience, Shah Jahan even asked a Safavid ambassador to compare with Isfahan, his new Delhi that was then under construction. According to the French traveler Bernier, 1659, the ambassador answered aloud and with an oath, Billah, Billah, Isfahan cannot be compared to the dust of your Delhi, which reply the king took as a high encomium upon his favorite city, though the ambassador actually intended it in sportive derision, the dust being intolerable in Delhi. What more confirmation can one ask, Gulru is saying, for the competitiveness of the intercrossed architectural histories of the three empires? So you get an idea that they were totally aware and they were competitive about, their architecture. And yes, there were similarities, but there were also deviations from these routes, which were taken purposely by them for them to project their own, greatness and their influence. Now, Dr. Sheila Canby, who's from the Metropolitan Museum, retired from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she writes on the influence of Persian painting on Mughal painting by focusing on one magnificent illustrated Shahnama of Shah Tahmasp, which was painted by perhaps 15 brilliant Persian court painters. And some of these painters, Abdul Samad, Mir Musafir, Mir Said Ali, and Dost Muhammad, they made their way to India and were among the first artists who painted in the Mughal Kitab Khana. Sheila Canby explores why some early Safavid conventions and compositions, in particular, some tropes of Persian painting, you may say, from the Shahnama, were more popular than others in Mughal painting and continued to be copied and adapted well into the 17th century, demonstrating this enduring power of the Shahnama of Shah Tahmasp in Indian painting. And lastly, Professor Sunil Sharma of Boston University, he writes an essay called The Indian Woman in a Persianate World, Comparisons Across Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman Literary and Visual Cultures. And he states that the Indian woman actually fascinated poets and painters in Safavid Iran, particularly as Iranian women at the time were strictly veiled. And popular works on alluring and wily Indian females from India, were featured in literature and paintings in narratives in Persia, such as the Sus-o-Gudaz, Haft Paikar, Hasht Bihisht, and Gulzari Abasi. Just quickly to mention, these were a lot of them were written by Nizami, but other Persian poets as well. For example, the Haft Paikar features the story of an Indian princess of the Black Pavilion, narrating the story to the Emperor Behram Gur and her popularity. The Hasht Bihisht is Amir Khusru's response to this story. So there is so much of interaction between Safavid and Mughal, where visual culture is concerned, but also where literary culture is concerned. And Persian heroines as well, such as Shirin, Zulaikha, Laila of the Laila Majnun, Shirin of Shirin Fahad, competed with real Indian heroines such as Rupmati and Padmavati in the canons of Mughal literature and painting. So there was a lot of awareness of the Indian woman in Safavid culture and vice versa. And in Ottoman lands, however, Professor Sharma states that the Indian woman apparently did not garner any special status for some reason. She was just referred to as a woman. In this book, the Zenan Name that he writes about, which has a history of women of the world, and the Indian woman just takes her place as one of them. So what I want to say is that the awareness between the three empires, culturally, artistically, historically, is brought out by just these three essays in the book, right on the Indian women, the Shahnama, and architecture.
Right. In fact, one thing that stands out for me is that the tolerance of the Mughals as compared to what was happening in the Ottoman and the Safavid world, with Ottomans being Sunni, the Safavids being Shia, and the conflict over there. And Akbar, if I'm not mistaken, admonishes his contemporary Safavid ruler, saying that, you know, you need to be more tolerant because you are the emperor of a nation. And that's a very interesting piece. Right. Thank you so much, Roda. Always a pleasure having you and listening to you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Minnie.